Welcome back to Breakfast Television. Eating when you're bored, stressed, or unhappy is not uncommon, but how to curb emotional eating? Nutrition and wellness expert Andrea Holwigner is here now with some practical advice. Good morning to you, Andrea.
Good
nice
morning.
to see you again.
This is such a challenge for so many of the clients in our dietitian practice. I'm glad we're diving into this.
Yes, it is such a huge issue, but let's sort of define what we're talking about. What do you mean by emotional eating?
Emotional eating is just when we are, I usually call it stuffing uncomfortable emotion with food. And so that could be stress, loneliness, anger, fatigue, unwinding at the end of a day. When you finish your work day, you put your kids to bed, and then you start to feel all of that stuff throughout your day, maybe that isn't feeling so good.
Isn't feeling so good, and that's why they eat. Okay, so how common is this? You're saying it's a huge issue.
Yeah, and for the record, everybody emotionally eats.
Okay.
I emotionally eat sometimes.
Yes.
Dietitians do generally as well. So I want to normalize that this is normal. We're not robots. We're not like perfect beings of perfection. Otherwise, frankly, we wouldn't even have a job as dietitians. People would just eat perfectly. They would eat enough of their veggies, and the rest would be history.
Right.
But what we know is we have emotional connections to food because there is so much tied up in how our brain looks at food and feels with food, and then because we are more stressed out in dealing with more negative emotions than ever before.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So I guess the question is then what do we do about this, right?
What do we do about it? Well, when we look at sort of
this all looks great to me
of what we do about, first of all, when we think about what we might emotionally be eating on, there's a reason I don't have broccoli and scrambled eggs and protein and veggie kind of foods here. I've got the comfort foods, and so our brain is looking for these types of things. So we know that these are going to be the harder to manage types of items. So sometimes people will work with really practical strategies of like, well, how much of those do I have in my house? For me as a chocoholic, having like 6 chocolate bars in my cupboard is trouble if I'm going through a period of stress. So we might want to like not have them in the house and go out and grab them when you have a chocolate craving, because you got to work a little bit more for it. So there's some practical things you can do.
Sure.
If you're a chipaholic, sitting down on the couch with a giant bag of chips is probably going to be very challenging to manage quantity. So again, you might just buy single bags at a time, or at least put them in a small bowl that gives you an endpoint that isn't an entire bag.
Right, okay. And is the idea too making the choices on what kinds of those foods? So you know you want chips, but is it better to have tortilla chips than potato chips?
At the end of the day, no. Because when we're after emotional eating-based foods, we're after foods for comfort.
Oh, okay.
So you could eat salt and vinegar chips, but if you don't love them, chances are you'll then just move on to the next kind of chip because it didn't even suffice for the craving.
Okay, all right. So be aware of what you're eating. You were also talking about being mindful, right, when you're eating. So,
and people often, I think, with everyone's busy pace, we're so unpresent in our body, and we're unpresent when we're eating. And so as someone that values mindfulness, it's been an amazing tool for me on a personal level. I love to see people, when they're getting into those harder times of the day, which tend to be the evening, I want you to only eat when you're eating. Eating should be a soul act. It shouldn't be done.
So we're putting down the phone, we're not watching TV.
Exactly. So people are often multitasking when they're eating. And so, especially with harder to manage foods, where you know they're comfort foods, you know they're more difficult to manage quantity of, you just want to slow yourself down, check in with what's going on. Am I even really hungry? Even a little bit of a pause can help assess what's going on. And then if you do decide to dive into the comfort food, you're going to do it at a much slower pace, a more mindful pace, and that can sometimes even just curb the volume of what those comfort foods look like.
Absolutely. Okay, and very quickly, because we're almost out of time, but I do want to mention the self-talk that a lot of people have when they're emotional eating.
So oftentimes people think, great, I'm going to work with one of your dietitians on your team, Andrea, and they're going to give me step A, B, C, and life will be great. And what we know about emotional-based eating is it takes some time to get there. So if you try some of this stuff, you try like slowing down, and it doesn't end well, it doesn't mean it's a bad strategy. You got to practice it enough that it actually starts to shift behavior change.
Okay, so keep that in mind. It doesn't go so fast right at the beginning. Okay, Andrea, thank you so much. Great information as always. We're going to go for a break here on BT. When we come back, we've got news, weather, and traffic. Stay with us.